In this video, I'm gonna give you some cinematic filmmaking tips that'll take you from beginner to homegrown cinematographer in under an hour. I'm gonna show you everything from the basics all the way to more advanced techniques so that by the end of this video, you'll be able to go out by yourself and create professional videos no matter what camera you have. Think of it like going to film school, but in the comfort of your own home, all summarized in this video. This is the ultimate crash course in cinematic filmmaking. We're gonna start with the basics and then dive a little bit deeper to improve your understanding of cinematography. We'll also cover handheld filming, achieving shallow depth of field, cinematic framing and composition, lighting, and so much more. So let's start with an understanding of the basics by looking at the big three: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. So let's break this down. We're gonna go through each one by one, and we're gonna go over the two main functions of each. Now, each of the three controls exposure, but on top of that, each of the three also has an artistic control. So let's start with aperture. Aperture is the measure of how open or closed the iris of your lens is, and it's measured in a term called f-stop. The larger your f-stop number, the more closed down your iris is, which means it lets in less light, and thus the exposure is darker. The smaller your f-stop number, the larger the opening of your iris, meaning it's letting in more light, meaning you have a brighter exposure. Now, there is an artistic use of aperture as well, and that's depth of field. When you have a low f-stop number, meaning you're letting in a lot of light and your exposure is brighter, you're gonna have a shallower depth of field. This is how you're gonna have nice cinematic look in your photos and in your videos. When you have a higher aperture or f-stop number, you're gonna have a much larger depth of field. This is great when you're shooting some sort of landscape or environment where you want everything in focus. Second, we've got shutter. Now, the shutter is the measure of how long the shutter of your camera is open and thus allowing light to hit your camera sensor. So when we've got a fast shutter, 1/2000th of a second, for example, it means that you're gonna be letting in less light. You're only letting in light for 1/2000th of a second, which means it's gonna be a darker exposure than a longer shutter speed because you're only letting in that brief amount of light. If we have a longer exposure, say 15 seconds, that means your shutter's open for 15 whole seconds and letting in light for that entire amount of time, which means it's gonna be a much brighter exposure. Now, that's the exposure level of shutter, but what's the artistic use? Well, the artistic use is motion blur. When you have a very fast shutter, you're essentially freezing time. You could be taking an action photo or some sort of sport photo with a high shutter, and it's freezing that action. You won't see any blur. It's as though everything is just stopping. However, if you have a long exposure, you're gonna start to have blur in your shots because the shutter is open wide and every motion that's happening for the entirety of that shutter being open is getting captured by the sensor. With long shutter speeds, this is how you're gonna get those the light trail photographs, or you're gonna get photos of the stars. It's when you're doing these very long exposures that you can do these sort of tricks. But for these, you wanna make sure that your camera's on a tripod because any motion in the camera is gonna be picked up by the sensor. And finally, we have ISO. ISO measures the sensitivity or the post-image grain in your sensor. So what this means, when you have a high ISO, it means that your camera sensor is more sensitive to light. So it's gonna be a brighter exposure. However, it's also more sensitive to grain. So your image actually breaks down a little and gets somewhat grainy and noisy. Whereas if you have a low ISO, somewhere around 100, you're gonna have a lot less sensitivity, which means that your exposure is darker, but your image is a lot crisper and less grainy. This is something to think about when you're in a dark place and you've already adjusted your shutter and aperture and you need to play with your ISO. If you push the limits too high, then you're gonna run into some grain issues when you're looking back at your footage or your photos. Based on the artistic look that you're going for, you can combine any of these three. When you wanna get your exposure to the right level and you wanna adjust your depth of field, your motion blur, and make sure that your camera sensitivity is at the proper levels, these are the three that you need to use. And you can sort of get a sense of how their relationship works hand in hand. Now that you have an understanding of the big three, you have a much better sense of how your camera works. Aperture, shutter speed, and ISO work in tandem to ensure you get a proper exposure to your shots and to also achieve a number of artistic effects. And one of those effects that can really help to achieve a cinematic look is depth of field. So let's jump in and dive a little deeper into depth of field. It's the range of what is in focus in your shot. It's the distance from the nearest object in focus to the furthest object in focus within your frame. You can see in this photo from photographylife.com that we can have a different depth of field. On one end, we've got a narrow depth of field, and on the other end, we have a large or wide depth of field. This means that we can have varying distances of what's in focus within our shot. So what are the ways that we can affect this? Well, there's three. You've got aperture, you've got the distance to your subject, and you've also got the focal length of your lens. So let's talk about the first here, aperture. Aperture is the opening in your lens. Now, the wider that opening, the smaller the actual number, the shallower the depth of field. So if we're shooting an interview at f1.8 like this, we've got a shallow depth of field. I'm in focus, the background is out of focus. If we crank that aperture up to something like f18, where we have a very closed down aperture, you're gonna start to see a lot more in focus. Our depth of field gets wider, so everything behind me is gonna be in focus in addition to myself. The second way to affect depth of field is distance to your subject. The closer you are to your subject, the shallower the depth of field. If the camera's very close to me, there's gonna be a much shallower depth of field versus if the camera's much farther away. The things that are behind and in front of me might be in focus if the camera's much further away. The closer we are to an object, the shallower the depth of field. The further away, the wider the depth of field. And finally, the focal length of your lens affects depth of field. The longer the focal length, the shallower the depth of field. So let's take a 100mm lens. All of the shots on a 100mm lens will have a much shallower depth of field than on a wide lens like a 16mm. All three of these things affect the way that light is hitting your camera sensor and thus are giving you those varying depth of fields. Now, why is it important to understand depth of field and how to affect it? Well, it can make a big difference in your photography and your filmmaking. Say you're a landscape photographer and you want this nice, beautiful landscape shot. You want everything in focus. Well, you need to know how to do that. You need to know that you want to close down your aperture. You need to know that you want some distance and you want to use a wide lens, and that's going to help you get everything in focus. Whereas a filmmaker might want to shoot an interview that has a nice out of focus background and really isolates your subject. Well, you need to know how to get a shallow depth of field for that. So you might want a telephoto lens and the aperture to be opened up nice and wide, and that'll help give you that shallow depth of field. So there's different ways that you can use these three options of affecting depth of field to give you the stylized shots that you want. The big three aren't the only adjustments that you might be making on your camera before you start shooting. One of the most important decisions you need to make is what frame rate you're gonna film in. Different frame rates can help you achieve different effects, like slow motion. So let's jump in and learn a little bit more about frame rates. So what is frame rate? It's the number of frames you're capturing per second in your footage. The more frames, the smoother the motion, and also the more frames, the better the slow motion. So there's a few standard frame rates out there. First, we've got 24 frames per second. This is your motion picture cinema standard. Pretty much every movie you've ever seen was shot in 24 frames per second.
Do you have any experience in motion pictures?
Now, there's also 30 frames per second. This is your TV standard if you follow the NTSC standards, which in North America, we all do. Things look a little bit more realistic than the 24 frames. There's also a PAL standard, that's 25 frames per second, and that's what you'll see if you're living in Europe. We also have high frame rates, like 60 frames per second. This is great when you're watching sports like football, if you're watching video game streams on Twitch. But wait, weren't there some movies shot in high frame rates? Peter Jackson filmed The Hobbit in 48 frames per second. Now, a lot of fans aren't into this hyper-realistic movie look. They want that 24 frames per second. But some of these directors are trying this experimental high frame rate, and they want to see how the high frame, smoother look translates in 3D and with their special effects. Let me know down in the comments what you think about these high frame rates in cinema. So, where's the magic in frame rates? Well, let me tell you, when you slow things down and conform them to a 24 frame per second timeline, this is the magic. Take a 60 frame per second shot and conform it to your 24 frame per second timeline. Now you're looking at a shot that's playing back 24 frames per second, but it's 2.5 times slower. So slow motion is where you can really get your frame rates to do some nice work for you, especially in your B-roll or in any sports or action shots. Now you may ask, why wouldn't I just slow down my 24 frames per second shot? Well, when you do that, you don't have extra frames to build in when you're slowing and drawing out your footage, so the frames have to sort of create themselves and your footage looks choppy. Okay, that's enough of the background info. Tell me what I really want to know here. Okay, so if there's any part of this video that you should really pay attention, it's right now. We're gonna do an overview. 24 frames per second, cinema standard. 30 frames per second, your TV standard. 60 frames per second is your sports standard. It's that hyper-realistic, smooth look. Now 60 frames per second slowed down to 24 frames per second is your standard slow motion, 2.5 times slower than the normal footage. 120 frames per second is a nice super slow motion. This is buttery smooth slow motion. This is your Peter McKinnon B-roll. This is that nice cinematic slow-mo. Now 1,000+ frames per second, this is your ultra slow-mo. You're gonna see the slow-mo guys on YouTube. This is super, super slow-mo. This stuff is crazy. Okay, so what frame rate should I use? Well, there's no one size fits all when it comes to frame rates. We've got 24 frames a second if you want to go out there and shoot a nice interview or a nice normal speed shot. Then say you want to shoot something that looks like it's meant for TV and a video playback. We'll jump over to 30 frames per second. Then you want to get some slow motion B-roll, kick it over to 60 frames per second. Then you want to shoot another interview, jump back to 24 frames per second. What I'm getting at is that you're going to have to bounce around with your frame rates as you're out on a shoot. People do this all the time. You just need to think ahead about what you're gonna want your video to play back like or look like when the video is finally edited, and just jump around on your frame rates on your camera before shooting. And one thing to remember is keep your shutter speed in your camera always double the frame rate that you're shooting. So if you're shooting 24 frames per second, you wanna be around 1/48 or 1/50 for your shutter. If you're shooting 120 frames per second, you wanna be around 1/240 for your shutter. Frame rate is a critical decision for any filmmaker. But not just because of the way it looks. It also can affect the quality and size of your video files. To understand this a little bit better, let's talk bitrate. Whoa, let's keep the bitrate of this video actually decent enough so you can see. That's better. So bitrate is the amount of data that's encoded per second in a video. Now, what does that all mean? Well, in a very basic sense, the higher the bitrate of your video, the higher the quality of your video. On the alternative side, the higher the bitrate, the larger the file size of your video. Now, it's important to understand that resolution is different from bitrate. Resolution is the pixel size of your video. So if you have something that's 1920 by 1080, that is the resolution of your video. A 1920 by 1080 HD video can have different bit rates. So if we take two examples of an HD video, 1920 by 1080, on one side, we can have a low bit rate, meaning the quality is lesser, it's more compressed. On the other side, we can have a high bit rate, meaning we have a higher quality, a larger file size, but a higher quality. More data being encoded per second as the video plays. Not all HD cameras shoot at the same bit rate. This is why a GoPro might look different from an iPhone video, that might look different from a DSLR, that might look different from a cinema camera. They all shoot 1920 by 1080 HD, but at different bit rates, meaning that they're putting out different amounts of data per second as they shoot. There are a few other factors that affect why these different cameras look a different way, sensor sizes amongst other things, but the bit rate is a large factor in this. Bit rate is measured in megabits per second. When you're watching a video on YouTube, 1080p, 24 frames per second, the average bit rate that you're going to be watching is 8 megabits per second. As you start to look at 4K or higher frame rate files, the bit rate's going to jump up a little bit, somewhere in the 20s. You can upload a high bitrate video to YouTube and it'll adjust it for each setting of the resolutions that you're playing back at. So if you're playing back at 320p on a very slow internet connection, it's going to have a bitrate or a low bitrate version of the video for you, playing at about 0.7 megabits per second. YouTube will do all that encoding for you, but you generally want to upload your highest bitrate file to YouTube. They'll then encode for the various sizes. Now, a way to compare these YouTube videos playing at 8 megabits per second, when you're watching a DVD, it generally is a video that's encoded
somewhere between 4 and 8 megabits per second. When you're watching a Blu-ray, it's generally encoded somewhere between 24 and 40 megabits per second. So a lot higher quality on those Blu-rays. Now again, you can see some higher bitrate files online, of course. Hulu and Netflix are pushing the limits there, but this is where we're moving. As the internet gets better, we can upload higher bitrate content and play it back at a faster speed. One thing that's important to understand is when you're encoding a file, there's a difference between variable bitrate and constant bitrate. When you're exporting your videos out of Adobe Premiere or Final Cut Pro or whatever you're using, you can choose what you want. So the difference is, if we're gonna export a video with a constant bitrate of 10 megabits per second, the entire video will be 10 megabits per second throughout, no questions, no matter what's playing. There's a much more efficient form, which is variable bitrate. If we say we have a variable bitrate that'll average about 10 megabits per second with a max of 12 megabits per second, as the video is encoding and exporting, it's gonna adjust that bitrate based on what's on the screen. So if a chunk of your video is just a black screen or not much motion happening, it's gonna use less data to encode those frames of the video, meaning that you have a much more efficient file size. It can compress to be a little bit smaller because the whole video is not using that full 10 megabits per second. So I know this was a very quick overview on bitrate, but I wanted to give you that basic understanding that the higher the bitrate, the higher the quality of your video, but also the larger the file size, which is why some cameras that can record at really high bit rates need different forms of SD cards or CFast cards to actually record the video. Like if you took a Canon 1DX and were shooting 4K, that's recording to a codec called Motion JPEG. That's a very heavy codec and uses a very high bitrate to capture. So you need a CFast card to record this. These are expensive and they're very heavy duty cards for your camera. A standard SD card won't be able to capture that much data at once, at one time. So this is why it's important to understand that if you want that higher quality, that bigger bitrate, you need much larger recording devices, much larger file sizes. You need to be prepared for that, and much slower upload speeds if you're gonna toss it on YouTube or throw it on a Dropbox to send a file. So again, just to review, the larger the bitrate, the better the quality, but the larger the file size. The lower the bitrate, the more compressed. You get a much easier file to transfer around and store, but you're gonna lose a little bit of quality.
Now that we have a full understanding of the various choices that one can make before filming begins, we can start to talk about composing the perfect shot. So let's kick it off with 7 rules of cinematic framing and composition. Framing and composition is one of the easiest things that you can do to improve your filmmaking. It doesn't require buying a new lens or a new camera or any new editing software. It's just absorbing this knowledge and implementing it into your techniques when you take your camera out and start shooting. The first tip we're gonna discuss today is rule of thirds. Rule of thirds is one of the first things you learn when you're in film school or when you start talking about cinematography. And it's a compositional guideline that breaks your frame down into thirds. There are 2 horizontal lines and 2 vertical lines, effectively breaking your frame into 9 sections. It also creates 4 PowerPoint crosses. These are fantastic areas in the frame to place your subject because the viewer's eye is drawn to these cross points. According to the rule of thirds, positioning your subject on these third lines will improve the composition of your cinematography. The easiest way to start implementing rule of thirds is to go into your camera settings and turn on the grid lines. Most cameras have this functionality. You just turn it on and suddenly through your viewing screen, you can see these rule of thirds grid lines and you can start framing up your photos and your videos to fall on these lines. I'm gonna show you here a shot as if we just took out the camera and wanted to get the image as it's shown. Now, if we have it just fall onto these third lines, you can see the difference in how much better framed the shot feels. There's a real emotion that rule of thirds helps convey to your audience. And it feels much better when your subject falls on one of these third lines. If you're shooting the horizon, you might want it to fall on the top horizontal third or the bottom horizontal third as opposed to the center of your frame. It's gonna, again, add more emphasis to your subject and to the composition of your shot. A ton of Hollywood movies use this technique. Go watch your favorite show or your favorite movie. with rule of thirds in mind, and you're gonna notice almost every shot follows this rule. The center of the frame is reserved for authority or for teaching. You'll notice in videos like this one right now, the teacher is often center frame looking right at the camera. So not exactly following rule of thirds, but what this is doing is showing the authority of the subject who is informing or teaching a lesson to the viewer. So always start with rule of thirds when you're composing your shots. Then you can move on to these next techniques. The next tip is leading lines. These are visual pathways taken from things within your environment. So if you go out and shoot, look for some of the natural lines in your environment. That might come from a fence or a building or roads, and use these to draw the viewer's eye towards your subject. These are great for portraits as well. Put some lines in the back of your subject to help, again, draw the viewer's eyes in towards whoever or whatever it is you're shooting. Again, a lot of TV shows and movies use leading lines. They help show where a character might be going, or they help draw your eyes towards where you want to be looking on the screen. You can also break this rule and use chaotic lines to help confuse the viewer or confuse the character or subject in a show. So leading lines are a fantastic compositional tool that'll help improve the look of your footage and also your storytelling. The next tip is balance. This is all about finding balance in your frame. If you have one side of your frame that has a lot going on and not a lot going on the other side of your frame, you might want to start thinking about this tool. How can you balance a shot like this? Well, if you're shooting an interview where you have your subject on one side of the frame and not a lot on the other, try adding something to the other side of the frame. Add a lamp or a portrait or something that can sit there and fill the frame and help balance out your shot. Do this when you're out shooting B-roll as well. You can always think about how you can have your subject on one side of the frame and something else on that other side to really balance out the shot. It's gonna make your viewer feel a lot more calm and relaxed and at ease seeing the nice balance in your shots. When we talk about balance, we also want to talk about headroom and looking room. Now, what does this mean? Well, headroom often comes into play when you're shooting something like an interview, and that's the distance from the top of your frame to the subject's head. You want there to be some breathing room here. You don't want their head going off the top of the frame or with very little space. So make sure you're always thinking about headroom. And the best way to do this is to put your subject's eyes on that top rule of thirds line. Looking room is all about where your subject is looking. So if you have an interview where a subject is looking off to the side, make sure they're looking towards the larger part of the frame as opposed towards the shorter part of the frame, or else it's gonna feel a little bit strange, a little bit off balance, and just a bit confusing. So when we talk about balance, we do wanna think about headroom and looking room as well. The next tip is symmetry, and this falls into line with balance. Symmetry is when you have both sides of your frame matching each other in some way. Wes Anderson is a master of this in his films. You'll notice a lot of symmetry in all of his shots. Symmetry is a great way to shoot interviews and documentaries. It's a great way to use a background to help add some nice framing to your shot. And sometimes it doesn't take much. Sometimes you might have a shot that looks off balance and not quite symmetrical, and all it takes is a slight camera adjustment to find the symmetry in the shot. There's a lot of symmetry out there in the world, and all it takes is just kind of looking around and adjusting your angle, and you can find it and help improve your composition. Next, we've got depth. Depth is a great compositional tool to help provide more emphasis to your subject. And the best way to achieve depth and subject emphasis is by opening up your aperture. If you open up the aperture in your camera, you're gonna get that shallow depth of field that both looks and feels cinematic and also really emphasizes your subject. So open up that aperture, let a little bit more light in, and notice that background fall out of focus, adding that emphasis. This is also great because it's gonna remove a lot of distractions. When your aperture is really closed down and everything's in focus, there can be a lot of distractions and it becomes confusing who you're supposed to be looking at in a frame. By opening that up, we get a shallow depth of field and we lose a lot of those distractions. You can also add depth to your frame by pulling your subject away from the background. This is a great tool when you're shooting an interview because it lets that background fall off and fall out of focus. A lot of beginners will place their subject right up against a wall to shoot an interview, and you just aren't gonna get that same type of depth. So pull your subject away, have some space in the background, and maybe even consider adding something to the foreground, a plant or some sort of texture element in the foreground to show that there is depth in your shot. Next, we've got frame within a frame. This is using elements within your environment to help frame up your subject. Now, this can be used in a lot of stylistic ways. It's not always easy to do, but when you can do this, it makes a big difference in your footage. Try shooting your subject through a window or through any opening that you might find out in the real world. This adds that additional framing and can help, again, emphasize your subject and tell your story. You'll notice this in a lot of films and TV shows as well, adding that additional frame, and it can make a really, really big difference in your composition. The final tip is to emphasize your subject. Now, this is something we've been talking about throughout this whole video. And really, you're gonna wanna use all of the tools we've already discussed to do exactly this. Emphasize your subject. Use rule of thirds, use depth, use symmetry and leading lines to show who it is you're telling the story of. We don't want to confuse our viewers, we want to help them understand what we're trying to tell them. And by using these framing and compositional tips, we can definitely emphasize our subjects and make our stories that much easier to understand. So overall, framing and composition is really not that hard to do. Try applying some of these tips the next time you're out shooting and see how they improve your cinematography. See how you can use the rule of thirds to adjust your interviews and get your B-roll shots looking that much nicer. See what kind of leading lines you can see out in the real world to show where a character might be going or to add emphasis to your portraits. You can start using all of these tips today to improve your framing and composition. And finally, we've got to talk about lighting, one of the most critical components of filmmaking. So let's take a look at 7 rules of cinematic lighting.
How important is lighting when it comes to filmmaking? Let me show you. Take this shot, for example. A classic interview setup. We've got a nice soft key light over here, casting a little bit of shadow on this side of my face, nice and evenly lit here, but instantly, the tone changes to something reminiscent of a horror film. The entire scene shifts, but only one light has changed. In this video, I'm gonna show you 7 tips for lighting that are gonna step up your filmmaking. Filmmakers and content creators around the world are learning just how critical that lighting can be in telling your story and shaping your imagery. This one factor can make a scene feel happy and bright, somber and dark, upbeat and funky, or any number of other moods. Lighting is one of the most underrated factors in the filmmaking game, and if you can truly master it and put just a little bit of time, even just this video into it, you'll be miles ahead. With proper lighting, a simple iPhone can look better than a $60,000 cinema camera. I'm not joking when I say that lighting is one of the most critical factors in taking a bad shot and making it look like a great shot. So let's look at 7 ways that lighting can improve your filmmaking. Direction. The direction of your light can entirely change the mood of your scene. Just think of the example at the beginning of this video. Simply moving the light from the side of my face to beneath my face changed the tone from a nice interview setup to that of a horror film. The simple direction of the light entirely changed the mood of the scene. For a more natural look, you generally want to keep the light at about a 45-degree angle from the face. This will cast shadows on the opposite side, and it'll often give you what's called a Rembrandt triangle. This is a little triangle of light on the off side of the face that came from the artist Rembrandt. You would see it in his paintings, but you'll see it all the time in movies, in TV shows, and interviews. It's a really natural and nice looking way to light. To achieve a more villainous look, try putting the light directly below your subject. As we saw at the beginning of this video, you'll see this all the time in horror films, in scary movies, in shows that want to make someone look villainous. For a more tired and depressed look, you want to put the light directly above someone's head. This will elongate the shadows on their face, particularly underneath their eyes, making them look sleepy and tired.
So as you can see, you can achieve a number of different moods and feels just by the direction of your light. Try experimenting with different lighting angles to see what various looks you can get. The next tip is to shoot from the shadows. So what exactly does this mean? Well, the idea behind this is that you want to shoot towards the brightest part of your scene. You want to shoot into the shadows. Now, what will this do? Well, this is going to add depth and contrast to your shot and make the scene feel just a little bit more dynamic. You'll be seeing the shadowed part of the face and then that highlight falling off on the backside. When you look at two shots, particularly in a film or a TV show, and you see the example where someone is shooting into the shadow, you'll notice you get a much more cinematic feel to this. So when you look to set this up, ensure that your camera's on the opposite side of your key light so that you're shooting into the shadow and achieving this contrasty, dynamic look. Now, all the time when you're watching movies and shows, you're gonna notice this. The camera is almost always on the darker side of the actor's face. That might mean that there's a window in the background lighting them from the back. That might mean that the sun is behind them, creating a nice lens flare. You're gonna see it all the time. Cinematographers use this technique quite a bit, shooting into the shadows. The next tip is depth. One of our goals with lighting is to create depth, create distance in our scene, separate the subject from the background. Now, when I talk about depth, I always want to mention the camera settings. To achieve a nice cinematic shallow depth of field, you'll always want to shoot at a low aperture. That's going to ensure that that background is nicely out of focus. So there's a few ways that lighting can help create depth. First is color. Using lighting color, you can help separate your subject from the background. So here, my key light is more of a bluish color, whereas the backlight is more of that dark, orangey, reddish color, and that's creating separation so that I don't blend in with my back wall. So often what you'll want to do is use color and use complementary colors to create that distinction. Blues and oranges work really well for this. This is why you're going to see blue and orange tones on a lot of movie posters and a lot of movie and TV color grading. It's because they're trying to achieve that interesting and effective depth between subject and background. Another choice other than color is brightness. If you have a really bright subject, you might want to think about having a darker background or vice versa. You can take this into play with shirt color as well. So I've got a very bright shirt on, thus I'm leaving my background just a little bit darker so that I pop out from it a little more. So when you're going to light your scene, think about how the subject is playing in terms of both color and brightness, and then think about that for your background as well, and try to have it be the opposite. So your color, you'll want to be complementary, you want it to be opposite, your brightness, you'll want it to be opposite as well, and that'll give you that depth. The next tip is backgrounds. Now, in many ways, background and depth go hand in hand. However, I feel that it's important to talk about background as its own tip because there's a lot that you can do here, and it's something that you should really spend time thinking about. Whenever you go into a scene, especially something that you're trying to make feel cinematic and not like a stage play, you want to look at background lighting. If we had this scene and the background was totally black, it would look like I was sitting on stage at a theater and just giving a monologue. But because we have a lit background, it kind of builds out the scene of this room that I'm in, and it adds some context. And again, you'll see this all the time in films and television shows. The backgrounds are well lit, they are intentionally lit, and there is purpose behind them. Now, your background lighting can be done in a number of ways. It could be practical, so there could be an actual lamp behind them, like there is here in this shot. Or it could be ambient, and there could just be some general lighting that's bouncing off of your ceiling, bouncing off of a wall, coming from a window, something more general in the background. Regardless of how you do it, you should always think about how the background of your scene is lit. It's something that a lot of people forego, they don't think about until the end, but it makes a huge difference. And again, you'll see in a number of different film examples how the background is lit and how it makes a huge difference in the play of the scene. The next tip is intention. With intention, we want to think about the reason behind why we're lighting and how something is being lit. What is the intention behind your lighting in the scene? So what exactly do I mean by all this? Well,
The audience should understand how a scene is lit. It should feel natural. Now, what do I mean again by this? Well, just show the audience where your light's coming from. It doesn't necessarily have to be the exact way the light is showing on screen, but you want to show where the light's coming from. So for example, if you have a scene where a subject is lit pretty aggressively by light at their face, at the front of their face, you might, in a next cut, want to show a wide shot that establishes, oh, there's a big window right here that is casting that light on me. Or if you have a flickering light coming from this side of a person, you might want to show in another cut that there's a fireplace right there, casting that light on that person. Even if that fireplace or that window isn't actually what's lighting them, there might be a big light actually right there. If you show that there is something in the world of the scene that's casting that light, the audience begins to accept that light in a much more prominent way. There's a number of films out there that don't do this very well, and the lighting becomes very confusing, and you're unsure where it's coming from. And then there's a lot of films where you see a drastic light and you think, what is that coming from? And then moments later they reveal, oh, there's a massive window right there, or there's a skylight coming into the scene that's casting this light there, and it all makes more sense. So with this tip, you really just want to think about the intention behind your light, where's the light coming from, and let the audience see exactly where it's coming from. One of my favorite tips is time of day. Now, why do I love this tip so much? Well, because you're working with one of the most impressive light sources there is, the sun. And we have very little control over the sun, aside from determining when we want to step outside or through a window and use that sunlight. Now, my favorite time of day to shoot is golden hour. That's the hour as the sun's rising and the hour as the sun's setting, when it's very low in the sky and you get a nice, soft, rich light with long shadows. You can do a lot with this. You can get some incredible lens flaring. This is the best time of day to shoot, in my opinion. If you're shooting at noontime when the sun is directly overhead, you're gonna get those long, tired, depressed shadows on your face that are coming directly down. But when we think about time of day, we can think about a number of the tips we've already talked about. We can think about depth. In the evening, when we're using that golden hour light, our light is very rich in color and orangey tones. So you might want to have your subject be in a more bluish color scheme so that they separate from that lighting at that time. So we can think about color and depth. We can also think about shooting from the shadows, putting our subject in the foreground with the sun behind them. That's going to give us those sun flares, those lens flares. It's also going to give us silhouetting. There's a lot of artistic uses that we can take into play when we're thinking about time of day and where the sun is in the sky. And you'll see this all the time in films and movies, particularly shooting at golden hour and taking advantage of that light being low in the sky. The final tip is eye light. Now this is a small one, but it can make a load of a difference when it comes to bringing life to your characters and to your story. You want to give life to your characters by getting a glint of light in their eyes. Now you'll see this in animation like Toy Story, or you'll see it in a lot of films. When they don't have that glint of light in their eyes, the characters feel almost lifeless. They feel dead, they feel scary. But when they get that glint of light, there's a glimmer of hope and there's a glimmer of life in their eyes. So you can do this by lighting. If you have a large light source pointing directly into the subject's eyes, you can get that shimmer, that reflection, that light coming off the eyes and giving that hope back to the camera. Again, you're gonna see this all the time in films. You'll notice that glimmer and you'll feel more connected to the character. So these 7 rules will help develop your lighting skills and in turn make you a better filmmaker. Let's take a quick look at how we can apply each of these skills to one scene. First, we add direction. I'll set my light at a 45-degree angle to create a natural lighting set. Next, let's shoot into the shadows. I'll put my camera on one side and the key light on the other. Third, we'll combine depth and background. I'll open my exposure for a more shallow depth of field on my camera, and then I'll light my background with a warm light to separate from the shirt my subject is wearing. Next, we create intention. There's heavy light hitting my subject, so I want to add some reasoning behind that. And we'll add a lamp near my subject's key light side so that the audience gets a sense of where this light may be coming from. For time of day, we're shooting currently in the evening so that light isn't pouring in from outside too aggressively and that the scene within the room has a nice darker tone. And finally, eye light. I'm ensuring that I have enough light hitting my subject's eye to give a glint of light back and ensuring that the character conveys emotion and life. And that's it.
So now that you know everything there is to know about exposing, composing, and lighting a shot, let's talk about camera movement and easy shot ideas to help you get the most cinematic footage possible. Do you ever watch those YouTube videos and see that cool slow-mo B-roll and think, how can I get my shots to look like that? Well, today I'm gonna give you 4 tips for creative cinematic B-roll that's gonna make your videos look just like that. Some general tips before we dive in. Always set your camera to slow motion when you're going out to take these shots. Set it to 60 frames per second or even 120 frames per second if your camera has the capability. This is gonna allow you to slow down your footage and give it a little bit more of a cinematic look, and it's also gonna smooth out and stabilize your shots just a little bit more because you're shooting with more frames. Also, if you're able, try shooting in golden hour light. You'll get nice colors from the sun, even some sun flares. It'll really help add some nice touches to these shots that we're about to get. So let's dive in. The first technique here is the foreground blur. This is all about using your foreground. Put something in front of your camera. It'll give it some depth. It'll show off some motion. Try shooting with a plant in front of your camera and your subject in the distance, and then blur out that foreground object. It'll really add some nice dynamics to your shot. You'll probably want to use a manual focus for this shot, or else your camera might kick out of focus onto this foreground element. So when you're getting this shot, try to go for a shallow depth of field and use a manual focus, keeping your focus on that back subject, and use that foreground element that's out of focus to really add some nice dynamics. The next shot is the twirl. In this shot, you're gonna pull your camera back and slightly twist it as you move. Ideally, you can have the camera pulling through a frame or some elements in the foreground to show off that depth and to show off that motion. This adds a really nice touch, and it's something that you can do handheld without a gimbal. When you're getting a shot like this, you're gonna wanna try to leave your camera on autofocus. This will help keep your subject in focus while you're pulling back and forth with the camera. The third trick is natural framing. Go out and try to find a natural frame for your subject. This is a great way to really add a cinematic composition to your shots. By using natural framing, you're gonna be able to emphasize your subject so much more and add some fun, kind of cinematic qualities to the footage that you're shooting. And finally, one of my favorite tricks for cinematic B-roll is the slide reveal. You can use this to establish a scene or to close out a scene. Put your camera right up to something so that it's blocking the lens. Then slide the camera out to reveal your subject, or vice versa. Focus on your subject and then slide it to be covered. This is a great way to set or close out of a scene. It's the slide reveal. Congratulations, you're ready to go out and start shooting your own professional videos. If you'd like to learn more about composition, lighting, or anything cinematography, take a look at some of the other videos on my channel and subscribe for more. Thanks again for watching, and good luck out there.